Hello everybody, this is Graeme Anderson, and today I'm going to be looking at Blazon. Now in this game you take on the role of a herald, selecting the different elements to be placing on your shield board. Now according to the back of the box, this game revolves around the idea of armoral bearings in the Middle Ages. And of course the role of the herald was to learn and to maintain the rules and protocols of the blazoning of arms. Now this is an absolutely fascinating theme that I know absolutely nothing about. I've seen these types of things, these shields in museums, and I know that there's a reason for the stuff being on there, but I have no clue what any of it really means. Now luckily the game abstracts it, basically to make it a game, but does go into a fair bit of detail behind the gameplay elements if you're interested in that. The basics of the game, pretty straightforward. You're going to be collecting cards to play them into your shield board, but to play a card you have to discard cards from your hand, and of course you also have a hand limit to work within, so hand management is pretty important to the gameplay. At first, the game seems pretty straightforward. It's a race to fill up your shield. But the first person to do that will not necessarily be the person who wins, as there are various ways to get victory points. So, will this game be like a beautifully ornate shield, or will it just be bland and completely forgettable? Let's get it to the table, see how it's played, and we'll come back for my final thoughts on Blazon. Here's Blazon set up for 4 players, but I'll only be showing 1 player setup. You're going to be shuffling the device cards and deal out 4, and the rest go on their spot. Shuffle the tincture cards and deal out 2 and place the rest on their spot. Place the animal achievement tokens near the main board, along with all the herald tokens. Now each player will also get 1 herald token to start. Separate the distinction cards into their categories A through E, and randomly pick 1 for each letter and place it above the board. Each player takes their shield and cubes of their color, 1 for marking their score, and the rest go on their board to be used on the distinction cards. Each player draws 2 device cards and 2 tincture cards for their opening hands. If you have less than 5 total prestige in your hand, discard all of them, then redraw. Let's have a quick look at these cards. Each card has an element type, square for device, and circle for tincture. It will have 1 of the 5 augmentations, or it could be none. These augmentations are used for completing the distinction cards and for end-of-game scoring. Each card also has a prestige or victory point value on it, which you will score when that card is played into your shield. And finally, each card will show you the places on the shield that it can be placed. So let's get back to the game. The goal of the game is to get the most victory points. You'll be getting points during the gameplay by the placement of those element cards, that is the device and tincture cards, onto your shield. You'll also score end of game points for completing the distinction requirements during the game, having the majority of each augmentation types, plus a few other ways to score points. The game will be over when 1 player passes or reaches 50 points, or a player has filled up their entire shield, or someone has completed all 5 distinction cards. On a player's turn, they will do one of 2 actions, either get more cards, or play a card into their shield. To draw more cards, you're going to be drawing 2 cards from either the device deck, or the tincture deck, or 1 from each. You then have the option to swap any of the just drawn cards with the ones in the face-up line, but they must be swapped like for like, so you can swap the just picked device card with a device card from the lineup. And you can only swap the cards you just drew, not the ones from your hand. Now there is a hand size limit of 7, so at the end of your turn, you must discard down to 7. The other action you can do instead of acquiring cards is to take the Blazon actions to add cards to your shield. You can place any number of cards in your turn as long as they follow the placement rules, which I'll explain in a bit, and you must pay for each card placed. To pay for a card, you must discard cards from your hand whose prestige points total is equal to or greater than the card you want to place. And each card must be paid for by itself, so any leftover prestige from playing 1 card placement cannot be used to place another card. On to the placement rules. Each spot on your shield has 2 positions, a top and a bottom, and each card must be placed so that its tincture or device symbol matches the same symbol on the shield position. Once an element card has been placed, it cannot be moved. And once an element card has been placed in a row, all of the cards in that row must be placed in the same alignment, either all on the top or all on the bottom. There are some further restrictions on the tincture cards, so identical tincture cards cannot be placed in the first, second, and third columns of the first row, nor can identical tinctures be played in the second and third row of the third column. You can play over top another card in your shield, and you can also change its alignment as long as, by the end of your turn, all cards are in the same alignment. And whenever you place a card into your shield, whether it's on an empty spot or on top of an existing card, you're going to be scoring its prestige points. While scoring your prestige points, if you're the first player to pass one of the milestones, that's going to be the 10, so 10, 20, 30, 40, you're going to take one of the animal tokens, which will score at the end of the game. All other players will immediately receive a herald token. Now the herald tokens can be used at any time during your turn. You can discard 1 to play any card from your hand and only play 1 prestige point for it. For a herald token, you can take any of the display cards or one of the draw pile cards. You could, for a herald token, discard all the cards from the display and redraw, or you can spend a herald token to take the top card from either discard deck. If, at the end of your turn, your shield board consists of element cards matching the requirements on a distinction card, place one of your distinction markers on that card in the leftmost unoccupied space. The earlier you claim them, the more points they are worth at the end of the game. You can only ever have one cube on each of the cards, and if you're the first person to claim that distinction, all other players receive a herald token. The game is over when one player reaches or passes 50 points, or a player has completely filled their shield, or they have placed their final distinction cube. All the other players get one final turn. For final scoring, add the following. For each augmentation, the player with the most symbols on their shield will receive 2 points. Next, add your points from the distinction cards. You get 1 point for each herald token you have left over, 2 points for each animal achievement token you got during the game, and you get 2 points if you completely fill your shield. And the player with the most points is the winner. Let's get back to see what I thought about Blazon. So, theme and components. For the theme, I found it fascinating. There's plenty of background in the rulebook if you want to learn more about the augmentations and the tinctures and the devices. The rulebook also states that at the end of the game, you've created a real Blazon, which is fantastic. I really like all the thematic touches in the rulebook. You know, they tried to also weave these thematic elements into the gameplay, but at the heart of it, it's still a game first. So some of the actions, if you're doing, if not all the actions, are not overly thematic beyond placing the elements onto your shield. So the theme, although really interesting, doesn't really help or hinder the teach of the game. For the components, they're good all around. Their cards are good quality and easy to read if the iconography takes a little time to getting used to. The wooden pieces are plain but very functional, and even though they are plain, I do like the way the cubes fit in the distinction cards. There are a lot of thought put into the components. The animal achievement tokens seem maybe a bit overkill, but overall very nice components. Even the real rulebook feels kind of upgraded. It's kind of got this plasticky linen feel to it, which is nice. Onto the gameplay. The basics of the game, very straightforward. You're either drawing cards or playing cards onto your shield. And I can honestly say the first time I played, kind of felt a bit underwhelmed. I treated it like a race just to fill the shield, and was annoyed to have to wait for that perfect card to fill that last spot on my shield. On subsequent plays though, I approached it differently. The race to 50 points can be just as successful as the race to fill your shield. And honestly, so can the race to get all your distinction cubes out. None of them can be discounted, and that definitely increased my enjoyment when I realized that. I do like the changing distinction cards from game to game. Now there's not much variety, but with the simplicity of the gameplay, I'm not sure how much more you could have added without really adding some more fundamental rules to the game, which I don't think it would have benefited from. I really enjoyed the ability to play over top previously played elements, but having to have all the cards at either top or bottom makes that even more interesting. Combined with the fact that you can place one or more card per round, often have me trying to figure out how to get this really high point card out, along with some other smaller ones to make sure that my row is still valid at the end of my turn. Another interesting mechanism is the drawing cards. You draw, then you have the opportunity to swap them out. I like that it was a choice after you drew the cards. Along with that, I like the addition of the herald tokens. Being able to wipe out the market and redraw, or maybe taking a face-up card from the discard, definitely has saved my game a few times. Now, one thing I didn't mention during the overview is there is an advanced variant where it introduces these things called abatement tokens. Now, these can be used during the placement to violate one of the placement rules. The token stays on the card until that rule is no longer violated. Then it comes off and goes back to your board and you can reuse it. But if it's on an element at the end of the game, you lose 8 points. It's not a huge swing, but 8 points can be fairly significant. But it does allow you to manipulate your shield a bit more. Now, this was definitely an enjoyable addition. I do find the game a bit samey though. You know, my approach from game 1 to game 2 was fairly similar. I also find even within the game itself, what I'm doing at the beginning of the game is kind of identical to what I'm doing at the end of the game. And I'm glad it's not longer than it is. It might bother me more, but honestly, at 30 to 45 minutes, it was fine. I didn't have a desire to reset and play the game again though. I would find to leave it for a little bit before my next play. The other minor issue I had is kind of the randomness. Oftentimes the distinction cards were claimed because someone just kind of got lucky with the draw of the cards, or they were able to finish off the shield first, again, just down to the randomness of the draw. Again, in a game this relatively short, I can live with that, but sometimes you feel you didn't win or lose based solely on your strategy. It was more your strategy, well, if your strategy got the right card at the right time. So would I recommend this game? I think I would. I think it's a light, quick enough game with an interesting theme that is definitely worth a play. I really enjoyed the theme in this one, and it was interesting with all the reasons why the cards go where they went. All the components are really nice quality. The gameplay itself is nice and simple. There are some ways to add variety to the game through the distinction cards, And I like that it tried to change up the standard mechanisms, like that acquire cards mechanism. I also like the game didn't overstay its welcome. And there were a few ways to race to the end, points, shield, or distinction cards. So people can be focusing on different paths, all the while remembering that just because you finish first doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the game. Now for me, the negatives were minor. The replayability is hampered by the sameness of the gameplay. You're doing the same thing the first game as the last turn of the game, and from game to game, it's not wildly different. I also kind of sometimes felt frustrated by the randomness of the cards, needing just one more card to complete a distinction card or complete your shield, and just having to pull cards until you get it can be a little frustrating. There's also kind of little to no player interaction beyond the racing aspect of the game. I do worry about the long-term replayability of the game. I can see this staying in a collection but not being pulled out all the time, but maybe you're going to pull it off for the theme because it is a little interesting. Still though, I'm going to give this game a 7 out of 10 in the Dice Tower seal of approval. I think if you're looking for a quick game that is pretty easy to get into with definitely a unique theme, definitely give this one a try. I may not want to get this to the table every week, but it's one I can see myself pulling off with a group, maybe looking for something a little different. And that's it for the moment. Until next time, thanks for watching.